Thank you very much. No, thank you very much for having me here today. My name's Joe Stanley, so my background is as a farmer. So from Leicestershire, back in England, so sort of dairy, beef, suckler beef, and arable farming is sort of my background on the family farm for about 15 years. And actually come to Jersey quite often. For literally for family holidays. It's a fantastic place. So it's great to have been invited here today to actually talk to you. And thank you very much for all your hospitality, those of you that have sort of opened up your farms for me in the last 24 hours and shuttled me around, especially. It was very, very kind of you. I would normally sort of pace around the stage and sort of get overly excited about what I'm talking about. But I've spent the last 6 months mostly sleeping on my 2-year-old daughter's floor. Often with her coughing in my mouth. Sleeping in an incredibly comfortable bed last night with no disturbances at the Green Hills Hotel has completely put my back out, actually. So I'm going to grip onto this podium and try and remain erect. But it's been great for the last 24 hours, and this morning especially, to be in this kind of an atmosphere of really positivity around food and farming, and see some of the see what's possible when you've got good relationships, sort of between the industry, between the farming industry, wider industry, and government, and see what is possible. It might take Kirsten and John back home with me at the end of this event. And see if we can install them in Whitehall, because, as has been referenced a few times this morning already, especially the impact of the budget last week back in the UK. Farmers back at home are frankly livid. It is everyone feels in a particularly bad place at the minute, and I know that you've sort of been through your own period of that in recent decades. I certainly am hopeful that is going to improve back home quite rapidly, because it has to. The imperative of a healthy and sustainable and profitable and successful agricultural sector is absolutely essential. As has been outlined this morning, to your island. So let's hope that does change in pretty quick course. But no, it's great to be here, and again, I'm very jealous of what you've started to build here. On to what I was planning to talk about. The Allerton Project. What is the Allerton Project? So we are a research and demonstration farm in Leicestershire. And essentially we're a working commercial farm, but we also have a full-time team of research scientists. And since 1992, our aim has been to essentially work out how you can have a thriving, how you can have modern, productive, and hopefully profitable farming alongside a thriving natural environment. So obviously, doing that since the 90s, it was relatively ahead of its time. And for much of that time, we've also been a Leaf Innovation Centre. Now, our vision, if you want to call it that, is all of these sorts of things. How can we combine a greater emphasis on the natural world with food production? So things like silvopasture and agroforestry, reduced cultivations. Things like beetle banks through the middle of large fields. Not so relevant, obviously, here in a Jersey context, I'll grant you. But this is doing multiple things, isn't it, in this landscape? It's helping to introduce beneficial crop pest predators into the middle of a large monocrop field. It's taking out of commission a line of awkward telegraph poles. So, hopefully you're going to save yourself an expensive bill repairing a sprayer one day in the future. But it's also helping to reduce downslope soil erosion. And you're being paid to do this under the sorts of agri-environment schemes that we have in the UK. So there's a lot going on just in that one narrow strip through the middle of the field. But also utilising technology, stuff we can do now that we didn't used to be able to do, informed by science and technology, like dynamic monitoring of crop nutrition through a season so that we can reduce our environmental impact by only applying what is actually required by the crop. Not rocket science, but it's putting all of those things together. Now, sustainability, food farming, the environment, it's back on the mainland certainly, and I'm sure here in large part since 2016, has very rarely been out of the news. However, we tend to get completely stuck in that bottom left-hand triangle of the sustainability triangle as I look at it. Really just focusing almost to the exclusion of all else on the environment and climate. And of course, in reality, Here I think 50% of the farmed area, of the land area is farmland. Back on the mainland it's 70%. Ultimately, we're not going to meet the environmental objectives that we have as a society and as government without including farmers in that equation. And we have to include, therefore, food production and profit. It's all too often assumed that just by focusing on wildflower margins and beetle banks, that we're somehow going to create a sustainable landscape and we're going to have farmers managing it for us. And, of course, we have to focus on the food production as well. And then, the other part of that is, of course, that license to farm, the social element. Why should people buy Jersey produce? It may well be more expensive than the alternative. And it's around putting together that story, right, of how, why they should support Jersey farmers, why they should support, the fantastic work that you guys are doing. So that's what real food sustainability looks like. Because, these are all the things that are driving that change. Which you will all be all too familiar with. And even if you do not believe in, for example, climate change, well, HSBC does, and they're going to make sure that unless you're doing something about the carbon emissions of your business, your farm business, then credit is going to cost more. And that's not just HSBC. They just happen to have the shiniest advert I could put on here. It's all things like that that are now starting to feed through into, if you like, the real economy and the runnings of our farm business. And, of course, climate change coming right at the very top of that. Back home, we've had the wettest across this band in the middle of the country. It's been the wettest month ever recorded in England in September, which is generally a dry month. Not just the wettest September, but the wettest month, which has absolutely annihilated us, planting crops on heavy clay. So, these are all the challenges which are facing us that we do need to address. We do, as an industry, hold the solution to many of society's problems. Agriculture is uniquely placed not only to address its own issues, and back home I'll often say, what percentage of national emissions do you think come from agriculture? Now in Jersey it's 5%, back on the mainland it's around 10%. Often people from a non-farming audience will say, in fact, almost always they will say between 50 and 80%. Now, that is the scale of the challenge that perhaps faces us when we're talking about how we encourage people to engage with agriculture in a more constructive way, because we hold the solutions to all of these problems. We're the only part of the economy, really, that can deliver on these things. Fine. Elon Musk might build a massive boondoggle factory that might be able to strip carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Maybe he can, maybe he can't. But we know that we can do that already through sustainable farming. We just need the support in order to do that. And, of course, heritage and culture. Here on Jersey, you'll be appreciative of that, even more so than we are on the mainland. And, agriculture is at the heart of a strong rural economy. So we have to focus on the solutions that agriculture can deliver. But, saving the world is hard, right? 15p for a kilo of root crops at Christmas or Easter in the supermarkets, which drives behaviour like this, because you have a contract and you have to fulfil that contract with your retailer. This is not sustainable. That is not sustainable. And, of course, that is what is driving this. It's also, you guys will only be too well aware of the declining margins of production of crops like this over recent decades. Saving the world is hard between climate change, market economics, what consumers actually want versus what they tell us that they want. Geopolitics, so we've just seen, an election result over in the UK, over in the US, which is only likely to make things even more volatile in that regard in the coming years. Government support, again, these things are all important, and risk. Farmers, of course, carry almost all of the risk of our food system, and that risk seems to be being escalated constantly. Now, black swan events. So you've kind of got all those consistent things, but then you also have what these black swan events, sort of unusual but highly disruptive events. Now, I've taken this from a lecture I recently listened to from Tim Benton at the Chatham House Institute. But what this is essentially saying is, these things, pandemics, major weather events, a bloody great ship getting stuck in a canal, this can cause the immediate disruption and breakdown of international trade systems, of where our food is coming from. What happens if China invades Taiwan? What happens if the EU and China go into a full-blown trade war? And, of course, again, Suez Canal, etc., hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. This is where so much of our global trade goes through, these choke points, which are incredibly vital to the easy flow of trade worldwide. If we are not focusing on producing as much as we can domestically, we are at risk of actually, globalization is often touted as a great way to build resilience into our modern lives. But of course, this system is, in fact, I would argue, very, very brittle. Because it's operating on a just-in-time basis to the finest of margins. If we don't have the resilience domestically to cope when things start to go bad, then we can very rapidly find ourselves in trouble. Because ultimately, we have to feed a growing global population, a growing population on Jersey as well. However, the status quo is unsustainable. This is a graph a bit washed out on this screen, but essentially of global biodiversity decline over the last 50 or so years. So I think the figure is that we have to grow as much food globally between 2020 and 2050 to feed a growing global population and an increasingly wealthy global population as has been produced in all of human history, but we've clearly got to do it in a much more sustainable way than has hitherto been the case. And that's difficult, right? Between squaring the circle of food security, climate sustainability, biodiversity, and the ability for farmers to deliver all of those things and turn a profit, is an incredibly narrow landing zone. You could liken it to landing a jet aircraft on a rolling carrier deck. But in actual fact, it kind of feels to me more, and this is kind of a strange analogy, I'll grant you, but the old space shuttle, it was a glider. It didn't have any engines when it was coming into land. It had one opportunity to land on that runway. There was no opportunity to go around again, and that's what it feels like with the food system at the minute. We really do have one chance now in the coming years to land it smack bang in the middle of this area. Anywhere outside that, and we're going to have implications for the global food system and for local issues around food security and, of course, climate and biodiversity that really don't bear thinking about. So, regenerative agriculture. Some of you in the room will be already quite tired of this incredibly well-worn phrase. Of course, you wouldn't have even heard about it 10 years ago, but the reality is it's a more sustainable approach to food production. I won't go through it chapter and verse, but more diversity, more living stuff in the soil, photosynthesizing, protecting that soil, integrating organic matter. And I've seen some great examples of this just in the last 24 hours on Jersey, how even though, in theory, an island which grows as much potatoes as you do should be an absolute hellscape for soil health. Well, in actual fact, you realise that you do it and have done it for a long time in a remarkably sustainable way. And again, it's squaring that circle of environmental sustainability with food production. And not every farm, almost potentially even every country will be able to really go down the route of the most sustainable possible methods of agricultural production. But this really is a toolbox of methods where we can all do something, and that's something which, again, the farmers in the room will be very familiar with. You're all doing something to move down this more sustainable route, even if you can't embrace all of these elements. And, of course, behind these 5 key principles is a huge toolbox of other stuff, of the actual fundamental practices that we can do to implement it. And really, Regen Ag, it's just stealing stuff from other methods, other systems that go before it. It's stealing the best bits of organic agriculture, like healthy, wide rotations, alongside things like, from conservation agriculture, reduced tillage, potentially even, things like gene editing, modern technology. It's taking all of these things from previous systems and it's smushing them together into, admittedly, a very fluid and flexible system, but I think that it's that flexibility which really gives it its strength. Now, just to have a few examples of the sorts of stuff that we're talking about. So, the Allerton project is a 300-hectare mixed farm in Leicestershire. We're in a very conservatively farmed landscape. But even on that relatively small scale, we can have a big impact. And in blue, this is the percentage change in population of some key red and amber listed bird species on the farm over the last 30 years. In red is our neighbouring region. So we are increasing our populations of some of these rare farmland birds, and you can see the general national decline in those bird species. We're increasing them at between 5 and 10 times the rate, for many of them, of our wider farmed region. And you know, that is a sort of a small oasis of really positive action. So even on a relatively small scale, and again, you know, Jersey is a relatively small marketplace, we can have a very positive impact on a relatively short space of time. Biochar, you know, what some of these things that I was trying to think, what are some of these things that can really apply to the Jersey market? So, you know, this is a regenerative practice, taking essentially biomass, burning it in the absence of oxygen, essentially turning it into charcoal, using that charcoal not only to lock up for the long term carbon from the atmosphere, it's called a greenhouse gas reduction technique. So trees grow, but of course trees eventually die. When the tree dies and rots, it releases the carbon back up into the atmosphere. So even planting trees is a relatively short-term solution to climate change. But if you turn it into charcoal, it locks that carbon up for over centuries rather than over decades. If we then apply it to farmland like we're doing in trials at the Allerton project, what implications does that have? Of course, it's a rapid way to increase the carbon in your soil. What's more, it actually potentially will hold on to nutrients within the soil and prevent erosion or prevent runoff. It will increase the workability of your soils. It increases the biological activity in your soils. You know, biochar has this kind of aero-like structure, which is a haven for biological activity and for holding on to water and for holding on to organic matter. Now, we're doing some trials at the minute. There are some issues with it, potentially. If you're using it in a direct drill setting, does it also lock on to residual herbicides? Possibly, yes. This is the sort of work we're doing at the minute. But the potential is there for it potentially to allow farmers to be, again, one of the solutions to climate change. By generating biochar, applying it to our land, we're not only improving the productivity of that land and the health of that soil, we're also potentially locking up carbon on behalf of the rest of society. And it will spread through conventional spreading gear, which is nice. That previous slide was raw biochar, i.e. just sort of chucked straight on. You can activate it by mixing it in with manure. You can feed it to livestock. If you mix it in with manure, it also helps reduce the emissions from that manure and from those livestock as well. So it's kind of a multi-use tool that farmers can have, not only, again, soil health, climate change, but also reducing the emissions from our own systems. Other things like, I mean, this photograph is a understory, clover understory in a field of spring oats. So again, you've got constant photosynthesis. You've got this clover which is competing with weeds. You've got free nitrogen coming into the system. You've got soil protection all through the year, at the same time as growing the same crop previously, hopefully utilising less nitrogen, reducing your carbon footprint. But also, I mean, I'm not going to go through them, but the products on the left that we're doing some independent trials of, you know, the potential for some of these novel products to, again, be utilised in a system like yours on Jersey to reduce your carbon footprint, to improve your sustainability. Seaweed extracts, we're doing some trials with at the Allerton project. I know you sort of already have a historic relationship with seaweed. By spraying seaweed extracts on certain crops, it's possible that you essentially thicken the cell walls, which makes that crop more tolerant or resistant to disease and pests and drought. So all these things that we're kind of learning anew, which of course our predecessors actually probably knew they worked, they just didn't know how they worked. We're now, you know, applying the science to try and work out how that actually does benefit us. Again, within the livestock sector, we've done some trials feeding willow just straight off the leaf to sheep. And as you can see, we can demonstrate in blue is the sheep that was fed willow, in yellow the sheep that weren't. Huge reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases from these livestock just by chewing a little bit of willow. And the reason for that is actually the tannin-rich nature of that willow. So anything, in theory, would do this, have the same effect. So, for example, things like chicory within a diverse herbal ley, or bird's foot trefoil. You know, so those herbal leys, which many of you are now starting to look at within the livestock sector, not only are they good for reducing your use of fertilizer, but potentially they're also good for reducing the direct emissions from your livestock, which, again, feeding into your whole sustainability story here on Jersey, could potentially be a really nice part of that. But not only that, they also help to reduce intestinal worm burden, so therefore reducing your requirement to use things like anthelmintic, vet meds. And finally, hedgerow carbon code. So this is something we've developed at the Allerton project. You've got a lot of hedgerows on the island. I doubt you're going to go around necessarily planting many more with an average field size of just over a hectare. But hedgerows traditionally have not been incredibly well remunerated as far as farmers are concerned. Of course, we were paid to rip them out back on the mainland not too long ago. But they're also fantastic stores of carbon. So some figures up there. If you could incentivize farmers to manage these not only for nature and for biodiversity, but also for carbon, you can start to stack those payments. And this is the work that we've done at the Allerton Project recently. So some of you might be familiar with the Woodland Code, for example, which is a government-backed scheme. This is also a government-backed scheme to essentially have the same outcome. How can farmers grow their hedgerows or plant new hedgerows and then be rewarded in terms of the carbon sequestration within those hedgerows? I don't know what percentage of some of your farms might be hedgerows on Jersey. Back on, in Leicestershire, as much as 15% of the land area of some farms is hedgerow, which are bringing in very little direct financial benefit. So this is just one of those developing options, strands within the toolbox, which potentially in a more sustainably farmed landscape, we have the option to utilise where we didn't before. And finally, this is a sort of landscape we like to see at Allerton. So we're conventionally farming the crop in the middle of the field, the best bit of the field, but we're surrounding that with additional habitat. We're taking the worst bits out of the field, we're putting them into agro-environment schemes, we're encouraging pollinators, crop pest predators, farmland birds. We're being paid to do that. They're bringing benefits to the agricultural system, but we're still farming the best bit of the farm and hopefully doing that more efficiently than before. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some sort of thoughts on this issue, and I welcome your questions.
That's great, Joe. I have some here. The first one is, in your opinion, how can Jersey sooner build a resilient farming industry that balances that sustainability, increased food security and long-term economic viability, would you say?
I mean, it sounds like, to be fair, you're already well on that road, right? You've got, it seems to me, the right people in the policy space. You've got this story around sustainability linking in with LEAF. You've clearly got the passion of the farmers, and you've got a historic, warm, fuzzy kind of image that certainly I can attest to as a producer. So, frankly, you could come to England, hopefully, and tell us how we can achieve these things, I would suggest. But no, it's great to see how the pieces do seem to be falling into place. But yeah, absolutely, I appreciate you probably export about 90% of your food right now, so food security is probably still a bit of an issue. But again, it sounds like things are afoot to try and ameliorate that situation. But it's always going to be tough for you guys. But again, you guys are always going to have to square that circle in a different way to how other regions would square it. You're probably always going to be focusing more on production rather than perhaps the pure environmental side, right? You've got very, very intense land use pressures here. But that's just, we can't all do the same thing. It's always going to be a variation across the piece, right?
Someone asking a bit more about what you're doing. So what new experiments, cropping systems are you really investigating now? What's next for you?
We are experimenting how to maul wheat into really shit conditions right now. That is how we are. No, the reality is it's incredibly difficult. You've been struggling with the weather, right? We're farming on heavy clay. We're trying to put annual crops into heavy clay. Last year, despite 20 years of building up soil health, we didn't plant 40% of the farm at all. It was fallow through till harvest. This is the reality of farming in climate change. Genuinely, what are we doing? Some of those things I've already sort of outlined. We're engaged in long-term regenerative farming trials across an entire rotation, which is returning some really interesting data. We are experimenting with cover crops and different summer-planted cover crops or sort of May-planted cover crops and what their implications are, different species mixes for things like nutrient loss, etc. I think that work might be of particular interest to some people in this room. So yeah, we do everything from soil to water quality, air quality, emissions reductions, biodiversity. So over the last 30 years, we've got something to say about pretty much everything.
I think this is an interesting question and something we were talking about in the break actually with a couple of people, but this issue of potentially poor level of understanding or maybe a better understanding now of how food is produced among policymakers and the public. Can farmers do more in this area to help educate people?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is obviously a huge issue, and ultimately policymakers tend not to take much of much notice of an issue until they start to see that coming into their email inboxes, right? Farmers, some research has just come out, some polling data from AHDB today. Across the UK, farmers are now the second most trusted workers in the economy, just behind doctors. We have record high levels of favourability among the public. So farmers have a good reputation, and we have a fantastic, canvas from which to tell our story. And again, we have so many of the solutions that society is desperate to find answers to. But I feel really passionate about this. I wrote a book a few years ago, which was literally for the non-farming public, because I feel really passionately we need to explain to them, why do farmers use pesticides? Why do farmers keep cows in sheds? And I think too often we shy away from those questions, and we want to present everything as, extensively grazed organic. But the reality is that the majority of our food is produced in a certain way today, and we have to tell people why that is. And if they want us to change, then they need to know how we do it now and how we can go about making that change. So yeah, I know you got that. We saw at the start, some of the great work that's going on some farms on Jersey to try and better inform the public, and we need to do a lot more of that.
And we're hearing a lot more about regen, which is great, and you touched on that in your talk. People are asking, what has that done for productivity on your farm, Joe?
It's reduced it.
Okay.
So across our first
probably not
5
the answer
years,
people are looking for.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? So across the first 5 years of our regenerative agriculture trial, our yield decreased by 10%. Our profitability increased by 15% because we were saving a hell of a lot of money by not cultivating, by having less bits of machinery lying around, by spending less time in the fields. So I suppose the question is, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve maximum output, maximum gross output, or are you trying to achieve more profitability? And again, retasking each acre or each verge of your farms to the best effect is what we need to be focusing on. How can you maximize income from every acre? And that might not necessarily mean growing a crop on it. It might mean doing something environmental with it, which will not only bring you a stable income in an unstable world, but it will also help, hopefully, the farmed bits of your land.
So it is a good news story for those farmers that are sceptical about it. How would you answer them?
I used to be sceptical about it. I was very vocally. It was insufferable. But the reality is, I became curious. I was like, okay, is it a silly thing, this whole regenerative farming? Actually, go out, look at the evidence, visit other farms, and keep an open mind. And for me, the more I kind of see and learn, of course, there's huge challenges, and we can't deny that there are barriers to uptake of more sustainable practices, not least which is the economic element of it. But the reality is, we have to change, and there are huge benefits for that change if we adopt it in the right way.
Someone asking, how is your science team funded?
The Allerton project used to be primarily funded from farm income, but that has not really, that's kind of flipped on its head in recent years. So now we're mostly funded. The farm is carried by the research, essentially. So we'll be funded by government, we might be funded by a university, we might be funded by, I don't know if there's anyone in the room wants to fund us to do something, we'll have a look at that. But essentially, anyone who comes to us from the organic sector to an agrochemical firm who genuinely wants to do some research into some sort of sustainability options, then we will, that's how we predominantly fund ourselves at the moment. We're a charity, so we're a small charity, and research funding from a really wide variety of, that sounded like a very suspicious question.
Well, I have just one more for you, and that is, how do we change consumers' obsession with cheap food, really aided and abetted by the major retailers, would you say?
Yeah, that's the key thing, isn't it? And the reality is that food in the UK has gone from 30% of disposable income back in the 1960s of the average household income to 10% today. But that doesn't mean that I was just talking to David about food banks, and of course there's many reasons why food bank usage has absolutely exploded in the last decade. But among them is that people are in extreme. There are more people living in hardship and extreme poverty. So farmers telling people you must pay more for food, isn't really going to cut it. Of course, the reality is that energy, housing, transport, all of these costs have absolutely escalated to a terrifying degree in the last 20 years. Food has never been cheaper. And of course, there's always going to be an externality. When something's too good to be true, it generally is. And with food, that's, essentially there's going to be an environmental impact there somewhere, or probably a labour impact, right? The reality is that farmers take home around 5% of the value of the food chain in the UK. 5% of the value. We need to see more, I think, a fairer return, ultimately, from that food chain. Government subsidies are only ever going to take us so far. Ultimately, we need to be paid a fair price for the produce that we are producing, and that is a bigger conversation. But also, of course, when it comes to natural capital, we have to make sure that this emerging market for things like clean water, biodiversity, etc., that is the service that farmers are providing. And unlike with food, we can't allow ourselves to be put in a place where we're just picking up the scraps at the bottom of that pyramid. Farmers have to make sure we get a fair price for that natural capital market from the outset.